Chapter 4. Listen up. I don't know about you, but I found that many of my patients with ADHD find listening almost impossible. Whether your math teacher is explaining prime numbers or your parents ask you to take out the trash, half the time you're likely just not paying attention. And the other half, you likely hear the words, but the information doesn't sink in. If this sounds like you, I'm happy to report you're not alone. Whether you have ADHD or not, listening is a skill everyone in the world can work on. I've thought a lot about the biggest challenges students with ADHD face when it comes to listening, and these came out on top. Paying attention to the speaker, remembering what was said, not getting distracted by other things, and finally, not falling asleep. What can I say? It happens. And you guessed it, I researched a bunch of tips to help even the most distractible students listen well. Challenge: paying attention. How many times do you hear this from a teacher or professor? Please pay attention. If only it were that easy. It turns out, paying attention to what someone is saying can be extra difficult for students with ADHD. I've often said, if all students have a short attention span, students with ADHD have one that's half as long. Imagine your brain is set on a conveyor belt. It can actively pay attention until it gets to the end of the belt. For some students, the belt is as long as a basketball course. For individuals with ADHD, it could be as short as a checkers board. Luckily, with practice, you can learn to stretch your brain's conveyor belt so that it's the length of a football field. How, you might ask? I have you covered. Tip: visualize it. Listening can be downright hard for students with ADHD. To make it a lot easier, try forming pictures in your head of what the speaker is saying. If your social studies teacher is giving a lesson on the ancient Egyptians, visualize a pyramid in your head as they talk. Imagine the Egyptians' faces, their makeup, the jewelry they wore. All the images you form in your head can keep you focused on what you're learning. Before long, you'll have an entire picture book on the Egyptians in your mind. Tip: look them in the eye. How often do you really maintain eye contact with your teacher or professor when they're speaking? Does it make you feel uncomfortable to look straight into their eyes? Me too. But that shouldn't stop us from learning. If you don't like eye contact, focus instead on the space right between their eyes. I promise no one will be able to tell the difference. You'll stay focused while they talk and pay attention to what they're saying. On top of that, it's just the polite thing to do. Tip: watch their movements. Okay, eye contact is great and all, but what happens if your teacher or professor isn't staying put and you can't hold eye contact? You aren't an owl with a spinnable head. Not to worry. You can pay attention to what your teacher is saying by focusing on their movements. When your teacher speaks, what are they doing with their body? Are they gesturing with their hands? How are they physically expressing themselves as they teach? We can learn a lot about what someone is saying and how they feel when they say it by watching their body language. Is your teacher smiling while they talk? Are they frowning? Do they look sad, happy, frustrated, or serious? These are all the cues that can help you pay attention in order to improve your listening skills. Tip: share a secret code. Some individuals with ADHD interrupt a lot. It's not that they mean to be rude, they just find it hard to stay silent. There are plenty of things you can do. I suggest letting your teachers know this is a challenge you face and asking if they can help. Often teachers will create a silent code, such as touching their nose or a quick tap on your desk, that will remind you to zip your lips. Challenge: remembering the info. Just like reading, listening requires us to not only hear the words someone is saying, but also to retain the information they've said. For those of us with ADHD, this can be an incredibly frustrating task. Like, I want to pull my hair out frustrating. Luckily, there are tons of tips to remember information. I often say it's important to keep in mind that not every tip works for every student. But by trying them out, you can see what works best for you. Tip: make a word. Using acronyms is a great way to remember information, especially if you have to recall the facts later on. For example, if your teacher is giving a lesson on the 5 Great Lakes, you can make a word out of the first letter of each lake to remember them better. Homes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Voila! You can also practice your retention skills by using tips like rhyming and writing songs. Tip: create a story. Earlier, I talked about visualizing what your teacher or professor is saying to improve your listening skills. Here, try creating a full story in your head about what the teacher is saying as a tip to remember the critical information. Let's use the ancient Egyptians once again. Instead of just visualizing the pyramids, make up a story about a young Egyptian you could relate to. Perhaps the Egyptian's parents were on the afterlife committee, or the young Egyptian spent their time making inscriptions because art was their favorite class in school. Whatever works. Tip: write it down. While it's great to watch your teacher or professor the whole time they're talking, some of us retain information better by writing down the essential facts. As your teacher speaks, jot down the basic points. It's a great way to practice note taking, and it gives your brain another chance to lock in what your teacher is saying. It also helps you practice registering the most important information. If you find this hard at first, you're not alone. It takes practice, so don't give up. Tip: repeat it back. No, I'm not talking about interrupting, but when your teacher takes a pause, a breath, or asks if there are any questions, this is your chance to raise your hand. While they call on you, repeat back what you heard them say, and finish by asking a question. This tip serves two purposes. By repeating the information, you implant the facts a little deeper in your brain. And by asking a question, you keep yourself engaged in the lesson. If your language arts teacher is explaining a lot is actually two words, not one, you can raise your hand and say, "You said that a lot is two words, not one. But what about when you say it really fast in a sentence?" Turns out it's still two words. But remember, every question is a good question, so ask away. Challenge: falling for distractions. Listening can be hard when there are so many things around to distract us. When someone is talking, most students with ADHD find it really difficult to close off their eyes, ears, and nose to everything around them. That being said, there are tips to keep our senses in check. While teachers can help, it's up to you to take responsibility for the things you know distract you. Here's what normally works best. Tip: choose the right seat. No, I'm not talking about the one by the window or the door or in the back of the classroom by your best friend. The best seat to decrease distractions and improve listening is the one closest to the teacher or professor, most likely smack dab in the center of the room. I know, who wants to sit there, right? But try it, and you'll quickly see how much easier it is to focus on what your teacher is saying, without being distracted by the squirrel climbing the tree outside, or your friend doing pretty much anything you find more interesting than your lesson. Tip: clear your desk. If you're allowed to have a phone or a game in class, turn it off and get it out of sight. Otherwise, you're just asking for trouble. It's more fun to look at what is on your desk than listen to the teacher. But this doesn't just disrupt your brain, it disrupts the entire class. Leave your devices in your locker, or better yet, at home. Tip: write a note. By placing a small note on your desk, you can have a constant reminder to pay attention. It can be as simple as writing "quiet" on a piece of paper and taping it to the corner of your desk. You can even write down your favorite tips from this course. Tip: find your strength. Exercise helps us expend energy. When we don't get enough physical activity, our brains can go into overdrive, which makes it much more difficult to listen to instructions. Physical activity helps balance things out. I understand you may not like running or soccer, but perhaps you'll like lifting weights or skipping rope. Every day it's important to get at least an hour of exercise, ideally outside. Find out what works for you. Challenge: staying awake. Another big challenge ADHD students face when it comes to listening is staying awake. How can you learn if you aren't awake? But how do we keep ourselves awake when it's so much easier to fall asleep? I've found that a few simple changes can play a huge role in improving your energy levels and alertness. Here are a few of my favorite tips to stay awake and listen well. Tip: eat the right breakfast. Eating breakfast is the most underrated tip in this course. Our brains are muscles, and we need to keep them growing. Eating a healthy breakfast within 30 minutes of waking up is the best way to keep your brain happy, alert, and focused all day long. High-protein foods like eggs, healthy fats, and complex carbs are all fantastic options. Crave something sweet? Grab a piece of fruit or a handful of berries. And remember, don't eat too much sugar because you'll crash by the time you arrive at class. Tip: Drink more water. Water keeps us alive and kicking, but sometimes we forget to drink enough of it. If we get dehydrated, we become sluggish, tired, forgetful, and you guessed it, terrible listeners. Tip: sleep like a baby. It may sound like common sense, but sleep and rest are crucial for listening and learning well. Students require anywhere from 7 to 10 hours of sleep every night. If you're not getting that, you can bet it will be pretty hard for you to stay awake in class. Try to go to bed at the same time every night. If you have a hard time falling asleep, try reading a book or telling yourself a story. I talked about getting 60 minutes of physical activity before. While exercise gets us stronger and faster and healthier, it also helps us sleep better at night. So there's another reason to get outside and exercise.